It's that the Latino eligible voters could play a larger role in these Democratic primaries because most of the voters who are Latino live in states holding primaries on or before Super Tuesday. How does that differ, Mark, from previous election cycles?
So about half of Latino eligible voters, half of that 32 million or so, live in states where there'll be a Democratic primary and a Republican primary or caucus as well, too, on or before Super Tuesday. By comparison, in 2016, it was only about 27% of Latinos who lived in such states, and the same thing was true in about 2012. So this is an increase from 2012 and 2016 in the share of Latinos living in states that have an early primary or caucus. But this is below what we saw in 2008, when about two-thirds, or almost three-quarters of Latino eligible voters lived in states that had a primary or caucus before Super Tuesday. So this isn't the highest year that we've ever seen, but it certainly is different than 2016, and it sets the Latino vote up to be potentially important in these Democratic primary contests, also highlighting that this year's contest calendar is one with more diverse populations in those states and among Democrats compared with the past.
Alma Echeverria is here. Is it true, do you think, that some believe that no candidate, Democrat or Republican, can win the White House without Latino voters?
I hope that would be the case. Let me first say that I'm also here as part of the Civic Engagement Committee, which is an ad hoc committee to try to get people to vote. We are doing a great job with different organizations and at the base on voter registration. And so much so that we have had a 190% increase in voter registrations. What we have to do now is get those voters to the polls, and that is the work that needs to be done and what is difficult. Mark said that we are not one issue. Community. We are very diverse. The only thing that a Hispanic has in common with another Hispanic is the language.
So it's not unlike anybody else, any other group in the country. Everybody has their own individual thoughts. But if it is true, as you believe, that Democrats and Republicans must have the Latino vote to win the White House, do you think that favors one party over another? Because I think more Latinos identify as Democrats.
Yes. I believe I can speak for Mecklenburg County, where we have a majority of Hispanic registered voters that are Democrat. The last figure that I have is 35,000 or so Hispanic registered voters. And of those, 15 or so, and Greg, if you have figures, you can correct me, 15,000 of those are Democrat, about 12,000 are independent, and about 3,000 or 4,000 are Republican. So it is an election for us to lose.
Okay. Democratic candidates have been spending a lot of time, for obvious reasons, in Iowa and up in New Hampshire, and now they've turned their attention, some of them, to Nevada, although some people are already here in North and South Carolina. They haven't invested all that much time in talking to states where Latino voters are prominent as of yet. Is it too late at this point to engage those voters, or do you know, Gregory?
I don't think it's ever too late to engage voters, but I think that if you don't have a solid network already, then it's going to be very hard to do it. As far as the primaries are concerned now, there would still be time for whoever emerges as the candidate to develop that. But at this point, it's never too late for one vote, but you can't get something big at this point.
But you have most Latinos, the largest grouping of Latinos living in places like California and New York and Texas. Although we have a sizable population in North Carolina, it does not compare to those states. So are they really a factor here?
In North Carolina, I would say only at the margins. It has been growing. The number of eligible voters in North Carolina is just consistently growing. Same thing in Mecklenburg County. But it's hard to say that in North Carolina you're going to see the same impact. I mean, it's impossible to say that you'll see the same impact as in Nevada because the numbers just aren't quite there yet.
I want to get some anecdotal information here. This is not a scientific poll, Alma, but I'm just curious. You're on the ground. You're
Yes.
talking to people every day. What are you hearing from potential and already registered and Latino voters who are planning to vote?
You know, I'm an optimistic. And when I speak with people about the importance of the vote, I hear people saying, I know this is an election that we must participate in. Whether or not that will show on the numbers at the end, we have to see. But we can show an increase in the voters for the Latino population in Mecklenburg County gradually. And I would like to say that we need to get rid of that stigma that Latinos don't vote. What we need to say is that Latinos vote in lower numbers because our numbers have been increasing. Ever since 2006, where 37 Latinos voted, to 12,000 in 2018 and 2,000 in 2019 for both the primary and the general election. So it's really a concerted effort. I would like to say that it's not only the responsibility of the Hispanic community, but really the parties have to woo us. And the candidates have to woo us, and the whole community need to encourage the newcomers, the immigrants, or the first generation immigrants to go and vote.
I think candidates should be wooing all of us
Yes.
if they want, because there's so many of Democrats right now running it. They need to be actually making their case. And Mark, according to an article in The Atlantic, Latino political organizers have described this primary season so far as a, quote, master class in political malpractice because candidates have been struggling to engage with and connect with Latino voters, with the exception, perhaps, of Bernie Sanders, who's been out there on the ground in those states where they matter. Do you agree, and why has this been a challenge?
So the Latino vote traditionally hasn't had the attention from candidates, no matter the year, actually. If you look at the years, this has traditionally been a challenge for the Latino vote, is that they don't hear from candidates. And if you ask Hispanic voters themselves, they'll say, nobody's really reached out to me, or we haven't really heard from somebody. Now, that is not necessarily true across all states. So, for example, Florida is one of those states where Latino voters tend to get a lot of attention, but that's partly because Florida is a battleground state. But in looking at this year's cycle so far, Latino voters in our pre-Iowa caucus national survey supported Bernie Sanders more than other groups of Americans. About 30% of Hispanic Democratic registered voters told us that they were going to support Bernie Sanders in their primary or caucus. That was higher than what you see among whites or blacks, and that's interesting. We'll see if that continues to be a pattern that we see for Latino voters. It also may reflect the relative youth of Hispanics, and I think this is another element that's a part of the challenge of getting Latinos both registered and to the polls. And I think that's one of the big parts here, a big part of the story for Latinos and why their voter turnout rates may not necessarily be as high as they are for others. Just a couple of numbers nationally, about 3 million to 3.5 million U.S.-born young Latinos turn 18 between election cycles. So there's going to be about 3.5 million since 2016, for example. That's a lot of people. On a base of 32 million, that's a large share of the Hispanic electorate. These are people who need to figure out where to go register to vote, and also to get out to vote. And they're also engaged with other things starting in their lives, a first job or going to college, et cetera. So these are the challenges of registering young people, but also it's a challenge for registering Hispanics even more so, since so many are first-time voters.
Gregory.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And thinking about the malpractice part, I fully agree, because I was getting a sense of deja vu, having been on this program a number of times, is that we seem to have this conversation over and over of where nobody's reaching out to me. The candidates aren't paying attention. They're late to develop grassroots organizations. So it's striking to me that other than perhaps Bernie Sanders, candidates haven't figured this out.
Why? Why haven't they figured? They have political experts they pay big bucks to to help them develop their campaigns and their themes, and to get voters to the polls, and have volunteers show up at their headquarters. Why are they ignoring a key voting block in some of these key states?
Well, I don't know if Oma has insight into that.
I believe it's because this is new. It's a new population coming of age, and we have just as a community let them just drive us through issues like immigration being more important than civic participation, which is probably our own fault. And we have tried actually to change that in Mecklenburg County. We have tried to reach out to the elected officials to come to us and us coming to them. And as a result, we had forums doing precisely that. We need them to know us as we need to know them. And that way, you can leave the malpractice part out of it and perhaps create a relationship.
Alma Echeverri is the former chair of the Hispanic American Democrats. Gregory Weeks is here from UNC Charlotte, Associate Academic Affairs Dean there. That's a shorthand way of saying it, I guess. And Mark Hugo Lopez, Director of Global Migration and Demography Research at the Pew Research Center. We're coming right back at Charlotte Talks. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and the Original Mattress Factory, providing mattresses and bedding hand-built in the Charlotte factory and offered direct to the consumer. More info at originalmattress.com. Tomorrow on this program at 9 o'clock, the pressure felt by students to succeed. It begins, I can't believe this, but it begins in kindergarten. And it runs through college. American students are stressed out, and that is leading to mental health issues. With SAT prep classes starting as early as elementary school, coupled with the normal parents' desire to see their children succeed, the pressure may be unsustainable. So how do we navigate this culture of stress and success? Where is the balance? We get some advice on that tomorrow at 9.
Are kids being traumatized at school? Most today are expected to take part in active shooter training. But teachers' unions say it's taking a psychological toll on millions of children, and they're asking a key question. Do these drills work? I'm Todd Zwillick. Lockdown, school safety, and the impact on America's next generation. That's next time on 1A.
1A from 10 to noon after Charlotte Talks on 90.7 WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source.
It's Charlotte Talks on listener-funded 90.7 WFAE and 90.3 WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. It's Monday. On Mondays during this political campaign year, we are talking politics. Therefore, we're calling this, are you ready? Sit down, Politics Monday. And with us today is Alma Echeverri, former chair of the Latin American Coalition and Hispanic American Democrats, Gregory Weeks, Latin American experts from UNC Charlotte, and Mark Hugo Lopez, Director of Global Migration and Demography Research at the Pew Research Center. I know this is primary season, and most of the primaries that are important are Democratic primaries because the presumptive nominee on the Republican side is Donald Trump, the president, the incumbent president. But Donald Trump has been focusing and targeting African Americans because he knows they are a traditional voting bloc for Democrats. There are more Latinos who identify as Democrats than Republicans. Is Donald Trump targeting them, Gregory?
I would say by and large no, but he does say that I want to reach out in terms of how strong the economy is to things that aren't immigrant related, basically. I don't know how successful he'll be. And then in Florida, it's different. We have to remember that Florida is different because people are focusing more on foreign policy toward Cuba and Venezuela, and he makes a very concerted effort to get those voters. But as far as immigration, pretty clearly, that's not going to be the case.
He has this problem, a track record that is. I'm not going to put a name to it, but he has been playing tough with migrants crossing and refugees crossing the border. He's been separating parents and children, confining hundreds to camps and cages, and of course he keeps promising to erect that wall across our southern border. How is that playing, Mark? How is that playing with Latinos and Hispanics in this country?
Well, I think it's as I had said earlier when I started talking about the Latino vote generally, it was important to note that the Latino vote is diverse. That there are Republicans and there are Democrats, and so even when you talk about how Latinos approve or disapprove of, say, the job the president is doing, 75% of Hispanic Republicans or registered to vote say they approve of the way the president is doing his job. By comparison, among Democrats, 93% disapprove. But even on issues like immigration, while there's generally agreement among both Hispanic and Republicans and Hispanic Democrats on what the priorities for immigration policy should be, such as a pathway to citizenship for those who are in the country without authorization, it is interesting that there are some different points of view about the way the president has handled the government's response to asylum seekers arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border. So, for example, we find that 75% of Hispanic Democrats say the government has done a very bad job with what's happening at the U.S.-Mexico border, but 55% of Hispanic Republicans say the government has done a good job with dealing with what's happening at the U.S.-Mexico border. One final point I think that's also interesting to show you how diverse the views of Latinos are, particularly in immigration. We also asked Latinos whether or not they think the U.S. has a responsibility to take in Central American asylees, and 56% of Latinos overall said the U.S. doesn't have a responsibility to do so. But that was really true among Republicans, where 76% of Hispanic Republicans say the U.S. does not have a responsibility to take in refugees from Central America.
We've talked about this before on this program. I think you were on several programs. We talked about this refugee problem and people crossing the border without documentation, therefore illegally, although people don't like to use that word. There are people in the Latino community who came here through channels and who spent a long time and a lot of effort to come here through channels. Is it true that many of them look at these people crossing the border without going through channels as people who should be sent back?
I would say in many cases, yes, but I think we need to separate two things. We need to separate the policy from the treatment. So you can say that we don't want to have a limitless number of asylees coming in, but that's different from saying we want to put children into cages or we want to use language that's highly inflammatory, et cetera. So I think if you separate those two things, it makes more sense.
So has the policy of the Trump administration turned off voters who may have, because of the economy and other factors, veered toward voting for him again, and turned them toward Democrats, strengthening a stronghold the Democrats also already seem to have?
I think it's potentially true, yes. But I think it is useful to remember that it's not a single issue election. So people are going to look at the economy. Right. They are going to look at other issues.
Latino voters in Nevada, Alma, have been credited with turning that state from deep red to purple, and actually to a solid blue state eventually in the course of about a decade or so. Given that, why haven't Democratic candidates been spending more time there? And if they're not there in person, have they been spending advertising dollars, or do you know?
That is, I don't know why, but that's certainly lacking vision, because at some point in time, the Hispanic community is going to be the largest majority. So we're going to be a majority country. Mm-hmm. And not taking that into account certainly lacks vision. And it lacks vision in Nevada as it lacks vision in here. And you cannot go only by, like I said before, by the numbers of the voters that are engaged right now. Is the potential of the voters that will be engaged in the future. But I want to comment on what Greg said about the division between the policy and the treatment, which is true. But they're so intertwined that it's difficult for an immigrant to see the difference. It's just the roadblocks that this administration has put forward on the immigration, especially for Latin America. Mm-hmm. And I have never heard in 50 years of being in the United States anybody applying for asylum in a foreign country, for example. And I don't know actually if that is legal worldwide, but it is certainly one of the issues that is forefront for Hispanics that are voting, that are already legal here, to be engaged in voting this election.
I don't know what Bernie Sanders has been doing in Nevada and other states where the Latino population is significant, but evidently he's the one candidate who's been doing something, Mark. And the AP reports that reliable polling on Latinos is scarce, but
That's
Fox
true, yeah.
News survey of Nevada Democrats in early January found that Bernie Sanders had stronger support among that group than among whites in the state, which tied Biden for the lead among Latinos there. So given the growing importance of that group, why would polling be scarce? This is a big block of people.
Yeah, part of the challenge is that to survey Latinos, you oftentimes have to do a few other things in order to reach them than you would do generally for the U.S. Population. And we oftentimes want to get a large enough sample size of Hispanic voters in order to be able to talk about groups among Hispanic voters. For example, how do U.S.-borns versus immigrants see an issue? So most national polls might only have about 100 Hispanic registered voters, say, in that poll, or a statewide poll might have 150. That's not enough to be able to say how young Latinos see an issue compared with, say, older Latinos or middle-aged Latinos. So that's part of the challenge. But to have interviewers in Spanish and to be able to be sure that you're reaching people, if you're doing it by telephone, on cellular telephones, both of those make it more expensive. And as a result, some polls may not be able to afford that, so they do just a general reach, might even just be serving English-speaking Hispanics. But it's important to note that there are a number of additional elements that you need to have in place to successfully survey a Hispanic population.
The Hill reports, Gregory, that there are obstacles to getting some Latinos into the process, into the voting process. One of them is language, and the other is obstacles put up to voter registration. Are those registration obstacles substantially different from obstacles that have been placed in front of other minority groups?
I don't think there's anything that's different from any other group. But what I would add is that you're also you're dealing with a younger population, which tends to register and vote less. People from lower socioeconomic status, which is also a group that typically registers and votes less. So that there are other issues, structural issues involved before you even get to the logistical process of registering.
And if you're young, and if you got a new family, or if you're working 2 or 3 jobs, time is a problem. Is that one of the key problems here in North Carolina for some of these workers?
and time, because you have to go to work, and perhaps you lack information that you are by law allowed time off from your work to go vote. So that type of information really should be put out there by media and by different groups. But I do want to say that Hispanics, millennials, are the number one users of social media. So I tell every candidate, every poll out there, that is one way to reach the young, perhaps born citizens of Hispanic descent, not only in this community, but in general in the United States.
Young people of all stripes don't seem to engage in the process as well as, or as often, or as deeply as older people. And you have said, Alma, that naturalized citizens from Latin America have negative experiences with this process in their home countries that keep them from the ballot box here. Why?
There is always a baggage that we carry around from our voting experiences in our countries. I was not fortunate enough to be of age to vote in Colombia when I arrived in the United States, so I did not have that privilege. But I do remember, for example, my mother, that was a teacher, and as a being paid by the government, a government employee, it was an obligation on your part to go vote.
You had to.
They had to. There was no choice. But also, what would they achieve with electing one candidate versus the other was nil.
So
It wasn't
are you
something
saying that they believe
could
that's
influence.
the case here?
Sorry.
Are you saying that that's the case? That's how they view the case here. One candidate
Yes,
over the other
because
doesn't
that's
make
your
any difference.
experience. That's your experience.
I was going to ask you, Greg, because you're a Latin American affairs expert, and you worked in D.C. For years about dealing with Latin American issues. If people take all the time and the trouble and uproot their lives to leave what they've always known, where they grew up, where they were born, to come here, whether they come here through channels or whether they cross the border in the dark of night, if they're eligible to vote, if they're legally here, why wouldn't they vote in the process? They came here for a better life. One presumes they came here because they saw this as a free country in which we elect our government leaders. Why wouldn't they want to participate?
Well, I would say that they're not coming here necessarily because they see the U.S. as free, but they see the U.S. as a place of economic opportunity and a place that's less violent and safer. And to pick up on what Olma was saying, I think that very often if you're disengaged at home, when you come, you're going to tend to be disengaged. The whole system is unfamiliar, and you have a tremendous amount of responsibility of other things that you have to deal with. And so I think that becomes a barrier that has to be overcome in order to become really an active citizen.
According
and
Go ahead,
I'm
Mark.
sorry, this is Mark. I wonder if I could add to this, because I think it's also interesting to note that historically, over the last 20 years, Hispanics who have naturalized, who become U.S. citizens, do vote at a higher rate than the U.S.-born Latinos. So we do see this gap where immigrant Hispanics are voting at higher rates than U.S.-born Hispanics. It's also true, by the way, of Asians, the other big immigrant group. But across the entire U.S. electorate, you'll see that the U.S.-born generally vote at a higher rate than the foreign-born. But among Hispanics and Asians, the two groups that comprise the majority of recent immigrants since at least 1965, these are two groups where immigrants turn out to vote at higher rates. So it is interesting that here we are talking about Latinos not turning out at high rates relative to other groups, yet the one group that is sort of closing that gap are immigrant Hispanics more than U.S.-born Hispanics. But I think that that's partly because of youth. Youth and the large number of first-time voters, people who need to be registered every single election cycle. That's an additional 3 million young people who are coming into the process. That's a big part of the story.
And according to your organization, Pew Research, Mark, just ahead of the 2018 midterms, half of Latinx voters felt that their situation in the U.S. was worse compared to the year before. 2/3 believed that the Trump administration's policies had been harmful to them. Is that still the case today?
That is a sentiment that we are seeing in much of our polling work, that the optimism that we had long observed around the Hispanic population, seeing, for example, that the future would be brighter for their children than it is for themselves, that optimism is somewhat not quite as optimistic. I don't know how quite to say this. It's not as optimistic as it had been in the past. And to give you some example about that, in 2015, about 3/4 of Hispanic adults would say they expected their children to be better off financially than they are. But when you take a look at it in 2018, it was only about half. Now, that's still higher than for most Americans, but that decline is pretty sharp and something that we're seeing in a whole bunch of other measures, and striking. But I think it's because California was competitive, Texas was competitive in a lot of congressional districts, and those helped to raise voter participation among Hispanics because there was a lot of attention paid to Hispanics. But Hispanics aren't unique here. Everybody did have a surge in voter turnout in 2018.
It's said that Nevada may be wide open, but also that Bernie and Biden are leading there, and that the Latino vote may be Bernie Sanders' secret weapon in this primary season. What's the appeal? I have 30 seconds, Alma. What's the appeal of both these candidates to Latino voters?
Well, I believe that the appeal for Bernie Sanders is the health care propositions that he has had, or he has, the college tuition, the free college tuition,
and Joe Biden?
Economics in general. And I think Joe Biden brings that sense of stability. of steadiness that our country needs so much right now.
Alma Echeverri is the Hispanic American Democrat, former chair. We're coming right back with more in a moment at Charlotte Talks. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Tyndall Subaru Gastonia, featuring the new 2023 Rose Subaru Ascent with room for 8 passengers. Details at tyndallsubaru.com and on Facebook at Tyndall Subaru. Well, it's been 2 years since the mass shooting in Parkland, Florida that killed 17 people, and since then, more active shooter lockdown trainings have been implemented in schools around the country. While the practice first emerged after the Columbine shooting in 1999, recently, some say the effectiveness of the drills should be reassessed. Should schools reconsider active shooter drills? Are they making schools safer? That's the topic in 20 minutes at 10 o'clock on 1A, and we will continue our conversation on this Politics Monday about the Latino vote in the primaries. Coming right up. Stay with us.
February is the shortest month, but fewer days does not mean less news to follow, especially with an election coming. There are debates, caucuses, primaries, and that's just the stuff we know about. With Morning Edition from NPR News, you won't miss a thing. 2020 election, it's time to listen.
I'm Lisa Wharf. Listen for WFAE's Morning Edition weekdays from 5 to 9 on 90.7 WFAE at WFAE.org and with the WFAE app.
It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE and WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about the Latino vote on this Politics Monday with Gregory Weeks, Associate Dean of Academic Affairs and a Latin American expert at UNC Charlotte, Alma Echeverri, the former chair of both the Hispanic American Democrats of North Carolina and the Latin American Coalition, and Mark Hugo Lopez, Director of Global Migration and Demography Research at the Pew Research Center in Washington. Mark, 4 years ago, Latino voters in Nevada were asked what their most important issues were. 37% said the economy, 30% cited immigration, with education and health care bringing up the rear. Would their answers, or maybe you know the answer to that, do you know if the answers today would be similar?
The answers would likely be similar. We're actually working on a report that's going to look at some of these very issues to see what Latinos name as a top issue. But these have been traditionally the issues that we've seen across the years. But the economy continues to be an issue for many Latinos. Many Latino families do say that they have a difficult time making ends meet, even though unemployment rates may be at a near record, if not a record low for Hispanics. And also education and healthcare have oftentimes been among the top issues for Latinos, particularly healthcare. And that's partly because many Latinos do not have health insurance, partly because of their documented status, but maybe for other reasons as well. So these are issues that have resonated for a long time with Latinos. Immigration, too, is more important for Hispanics than it is for others. But as we've talked about already, while it may be an important issue for Latinos and more so than for the general public, that doesn't mean that all Latinos are only focused on the issue of immigration.
Would the issues of importance to Latinos in North Carolina differ greatly from those in Nevada?
Not at all. I think that I would put them in the same order as Mark did, perhaps making healthcare a number second.
So which candidate does that favor? Bernie Sanders?
I believe so. I believe Bernie Sanders and I think Joe Biden would be a candidate that is as open to these issues as any other.
Do they buy the fact that Joe Biden said he helped implement the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, that was the
Absolutely.
first step in this process?
Absolutely.
Okay, I lost the question. I'm sorry. I'll come
Mark,
back.
again, one of the things I was going to say that's interesting about a state like Nevada is when you take a look at the undocumented population in Nevada, among Nevada's workers, about 9% of workers in the state of Nevada are undocumented immigrants, many of whom are Hispanic. And that's actually the highest share of any part of the country. But also North Carolina has an undocumented population that's relatively large compared to some other states. And when you take a look at the share of the entire population of Hispanics living in North Carolina, only about a third are at least adult U.S. citizens, meaning that they're eligible to vote in a presidential election like the one that's coming up. That's below the national share, which is almost about half. So it's interesting to see that North Carolina is a state where you've got many Hispanics who just are unable to vote because of their legal status,
Mm-hmm.
but it also points to what may be important issues in North Carolina that are similar perhaps to Nevada.
As you said earlier in the program, Oma, this is not a monolith. This group is not a single-minded monolith. They have various different issues that are important
Yes.
to them. But of the Democratic Latino voters, are they on the same page as many other Democrats? They don't care who the nominee is. The only important thing is to beat Donald Trump. Would that be the same in that group of voters?
I can speak for Mecklenburg County, and I would say that surprisingly enough, Hispanics are open to other candidates like Thomas Steyer, for example, that has a record of working for issues that are important to the community and for environmental causes. And I would say to the second part of your question is that at the end of the day, for the general election, I think we will be unified for the candidate that is elected.
So, Greg, according to Pew Research, finding a path to legal status for those who came here not through channels is one of the top immigration policy goals of Hispanics throughout the country. Do any of the Democrats have a plan for that?
I don't know if any have a plan that's laid out clearly, but I think many of them are talking in general in that regard. And I think that's been something that Democrats have talked about for a long time. Whether or not it's realistic, given the makeup of what Congress will be, is another question. But I think that basic message is coming out.
The Obama administration has been criticized, particularly as this primary season has heated up, for deporting as many or more people than the Trump administration has. And, of course, Vice President Biden was part of that administration. Is he carrying that baggage around with him?
Yeah, he definitely is. I haven't seen numbers on specifically how that affects him vis-a-vis other issues, but he definitely carries that with it. Obama was famously the deporter-in-chief.
Yeah. How does that compare to what's actually happening on the ground today?
Well, what's going on today is far more aggressive, like astronomically more aggressive than it was during the Obama administration. But we can't just say that Obama was this entirely pro-immigrant president, because he had a lot of policies that immigrants and Latinos didn't like.
At the same time, I want to defend the record for the Obama administration in that DACA was approved through an executive order that was a relief for many of the people that came here of a young age and are now able to work and go to school.
We have in North Carolina the largest, I believe this is still true, the largest population of Latinos outside of the Northeast, which would be New York State, and the Southwest, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, California. And yet, we have one of the lowest shares of eligible voters in that group. Why?
We go back to the same issues of different nationalities and different experiences, and also the young population that is just now starting to get engaged.
The number, I think, is 3%. The number of registered Latino voters in this state is roughly 3% of the population of voters. At those levels, Mark, are they a factor?
They could be in a close election. They could be a factor, particularly since most Latinos lean towards the Democratic Party in the November presidential election. That could be important if North Carolina turns out to be a state with a very close possible outcome. But it, of course, also remains to be seen. So I wouldn't discount the Latino vote just because it's a small share of North Carolina's population. But it isn't necessarily the case that just because it's a small share that it's going to be the decider in a close election. It may be, it may not be. There may be other electorates in North Carolina that can matter as well.
How does our population of registered eligible Latino voters compare to, say, Georgia or Tennessee or Virginia? Do you know?
So North Carolina doesn't have the largest eligible voter population among those states who are Hispanic. And when you take a look at those other states and you compare it in terms of, for example, the share that's eligible to vote in Georgia, there are 5% of all Latinos make up 5% of all eligible voters in the state of Georgia. And when you take a look at, say, a state like Virginia, you'll find that 5.5% are eligible to vote. And in both of those states, more than 300,000, almost 400,000 in the case of Georgia, Hispanics are eligible to vote. In the case of North Carolina, that number is a lower share. That's at about 338,000. So that gives you some sense that other states in the South are somewhat larger in terms of their Hispanic eligible voter population.
North Carolina, Greg, is a swing state. It was 4 years ago, and you said, I think 4 years ago, that one of the few paths for victory that Donald Trump had went through North Carolina, and he carried the state. Is the same true this year? And if so, what role will the Hispanic vote play here?
Well, I mean, we've already seen President Trump come to Charlotte
several times,
a favorite destination. So I think it's very clear that he sees North Carolina as an important part of winning re-election. And I mean, I think like what we've been saying is that the Latino population in North Carolina is the eligible voters is not large. But at the margins, it can have an important impact. So I think you're going to see in a general election both parties focusing pretty heavily on the state.
The idea of trust in the election process and whether or not my vote counts or whether it makes any damn difference whether anybody votes in this country has become a topic of conversation among a lot of people this time around, Mark. And I would think voter participation is affected by that. If you don't believe in the system or you don't believe the system cares about you, you don't vote. Well, we have the Trump administration doing all these things in the Southwest with people who cross the border without documentation. Do you see that as sending a signal that may be interpreted as hostile?
We certainly see in our polling that many Latinos say that the Trump administration's policies have been harmful to the Latino population. That's something that we've seen that really stands out compared to previous administrations. How that translates into voting remains to be seen, because if you think about 2018, with that sharp increase in voter turnout among Latinos at almost presidential levels, it's possible that even in an environment where we have right now with the Trump administration and Latinos seeing it as a negative for the Hispanic population, there still could be a big turnout of Hispanics in order to vote against that. So I think it is a function of many different things. It's not just about the Trump administration sending a particular message, but we'll have to see what happens over the course of the next few months.
As you read through articles about this, one of the themes that emerges, Greg, is that the Democrats have not done a good job of wooing these voters. They haven't come out, many of them, and asked for their vote. And you are more likely to vote if you are asked for that vote. Yeah. So what can be done at this stage to ask for their vote?
Well, I think that both African-American voters and Latino voters have sometimes felt that the Democratic Party takes them for granted. And Trump has actually said that out loud, like they take you for granted. So in my opinion, for the primaries, it's pretty late. For the general election, though, that's still months to articulate a vision and ask for those votes.
The president is an expert at throwing shade at things, and he doesn't always speak the truth. And he said that about other minority groups, that for 50, 60, 70 years, the Democrats have taken you for granted. They have made promises, and as soon as you vote for them, they ignore you for the next 4 years. And now he's doing it for the Hispanic vote. Do they see that as the truth?
I don't think so. I don't think that that we can take lightly all the policies and laws and rules and regulations that the Democrats have done at the national level and at the local level. So you would have to be really for Trump if you thought that way. But I want to say something perhaps related to what Mark says, and that it's a fallacy when people say that there are undocumented people that vote and that there is voter fraud, because that has been proven wrong.
Right.
And that is actually one of the issues that is brought and thrown out there to make us afraid, kind of.
Latinos support Democrats over Republicans, 69 to 29%. That was according to 2018 exit polls in the midterms. And perhaps around the country, it is true that Latinos support Democrats more than Republicans. Is that lulling Democrats into a false sense of security, making them lazy?
Perhaps. I would say that that can be the case, and then that is really up to us to make sure that doesn't happen. We are always working on getting people to the polls, but we forget the second part of being a citizen, which is we need to hold our elected officials accountable as well.
Again, Mark, according to The Atlantic, Trump seems to be on track to capture 25 to 30% of Latino voters this year, and that's a steady showing from his 29% support in 2016.
Yes.
Given all the things we talked about, why is the support so high?
It shows you that the Hispanic vote is diverse. And as we've been talking about earlier, particularly in Florida, with the Cuban population in South Florida, that has traditionally been strongly Republican, if not majority Republican, and that was the case in 2016. They make up a larger share of the Hispanic electorate than they do of the Hispanic population, partly because many are U.S. citizens, even if there are immigrants. And so that's, I think, an important point to note, is that this is a diverse population. Not everybody's going to lean towards the Democratic Party. And even among third or higher generation Hispanics, particularly Mexican Americans, many may lean towards the Republican Party as opposed to the Democratic Party for a number of reasons. And there's even more diversity there we could talk about, but I know there's this limited amount of time.
Yes, the clock is the ruler here. 4 years ago, Gregory Weeks, you wrote that, quote, if Latinos turned out in 2016, they could reach the rate of African Americans voting participation in the last election. That would mean approximately 114,000 votes. This could help nudge the results in one direction or another, but not giant-like. That time, you said, will come, but not until at least the 2020 presidential election. Well, it's 2020, Greg. Is this the year?
Is this the part where I write things? I have to be held accountable for them? This is horrible.
Is this the year Latinos in North Carolina make it?
If I said in 2016, then it's true. So I'm going with yes.
I'm going with yes also.
You may be the first honest guest we've ever had. Are we expecting a high Latino turnout this year nationwide, Mark?
It's more than likely we will hit record turnout. We've hit record turnout of Hispanics every election cycle back to the 80s, and that's because of population growth. I think the question is what share will turn out to vote. And in 2016, the share that turned out to vote was about 47.5%, not much different from 2012 when it was about 48%, and below the more than 50% that we saw in 2008. So I think it remains to be seen what will happen in terms of the voter turnout share, but more than likely we'll see a record turnout.
Mark Lopez is Director of Global Migration and Demography Research at Pew Research Center. Gregory Weeks is Associate Dean of Academic Affairs and a Latin American expert at UNC Charlotte. And Oma Echeverri is the former chair of the Hispanic American Democrats of North Carolina and the past chair of the Latin American Coalition. Thank you all for the hour.
Charlotte Talks with Mike Collins is a production of 90.7 WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from Mazda of South Charlotte. Wendy Herkey is the executive producer. The senior producer